What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to have back on the show for a second time MKULTRA survivor and whistleblower, blogger, writer, and published author, educator, selfless advocate, and one of my personal dear friends, Ann Diamond. A little bit about Ann in case you missed her first interview or if you're new here. Anne's story begins in the 1950s in Canada, where she was sold into the MKUltra projects as a child to prolific MKUltra programmer Dr. Donald Cameron of McGill University. She is an original whistleblower of our time and was one of the first to publicly whistleblow MKUltra and MKUltra in Canada, and has since given a voice to countless victims and courage to countless survivors of government-sanctioned abuse of all kinds. In Anne's words, quote, "The story of MKUltra in Canada has never been properly told. It was a pan-Canadian phenomenon, not limited to Montreal and Dr. Cameron. In the early 60s, much of what had been a McGill University program was gradually transferred to Toronto, specifically to York University, and an emerging countercultural scene that became a breeding ground for many Fabian and Tavistock-influenced movements and programs. Saskatchewan was another center for MKUltra mind control, about which very little has been written. Unfortunately, Canada's publishing industry is very much a product of that covert expansion of MKUltra throughout Canada. Books like Anne Collins's The Sleep Room presented a partial account but failed to get at the roots or hint at the vastness of this program, which was secretly promoted at the highest levels of our establishment, unquote. In Anne's first episode we did together, she shared an overview of her harrowing and yet inspiring testimony, detailing how her family sold her into MKUltra, McGill University, Dr. Cameron, and the crimes they were committing on children and humans unbeknownst to the public, her close encounters with Leonard Cohen, and so much more. Anne has also written her incredible testimony in her memoir, My Cold War, that I also encourage you all to go check out and purchase. It's not necessarily an easy read, but it helps to paint the landscape of what was happening in Canada and connect so many dots to what was happening with MKUltra in different parts of the world. Anne also has a Substack that she updates weekly where we get additional glimpses into her childhood and life that I also highly encourage you guys to subscribe to. I will have all of her links in the show notes for you guys to check out, and I would love for you all to go support her. Today, Anne is back to expand on her testimony. We will be diving deeper into McGill University, her family history, GATE and Anne's experiences in gifted and talented programs, some of her memories of being in the projects, healing, family dynamics, and so much more. Anne is a light in the darkness and a beacon of hope and perseverance. Without voices like hers, the survivor movement undoubtedly wouldn't be where it is today, and we all owe Anne so much gratitude for her courage to step on the battlefield when so few others were speaking out, and for continuing to be a voice for the voiceless. She's a beacon of hope, a wealth of knowledge, and a gift to the world. I ask you all to put away whatever you're doing and give Anne your full attention as we take a deeper look into her life and get the honor of listening and learning about her Cold War. Before I finish introducing today's guest, I wanted to give just a couple quick reminders and updates. If you'd like to be on the show, share any information privately with me, or send me a written testimony for my upcoming book series, or to be written in a Substack article, you can email me at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com or standbysurvivors@protonmail.com. As some of you know, my YouTube channel was recently terminated, and I'm being forced to pivot and use other streaming platforms to get this important information out to the public and disclosure community. Your support would mean the world to me on platforms like Rumble and X, where I'm currently streaming. And I also just started another YouTube channel with the handle at Imagination Podcast Official that I will be rebuilding and would love to have you all subscribe there as well while I figure out my new presence on YouTube and how that will look in order to dodge the censorship and backlash for speaking out about these difficult topics. Thank you all for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor, whistleblower, advocate, and educator disclosures. So you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming today's guest of honor, walking miracle, voice for the voiceless, anti-child abuse and survivor advocate, whistleblower, thriver and overcomer, content creator, one of my personal heroes, and all-around inspiration, the one, the only, Ann Diamond. And thank you so much for being here with us again today.
You're such a generous, interviewer. I just have to say that's why your show works so well. You have such a generous heart. Anyway, thank you.
It's an honor to have you back, and it's so good to see you again. It's been a little while since you've been on, and even though you and I keep in touch and we talk, I thought it would be a great idea to have you back as you've started doing some more podcasts here and there, and you've been writing more on your Substack and have remembered a little bit more and have been talking about a little bit more. And obviously, with remembering any of this, there's always more insights to gain. So I thought it would be great to catch up on with you and to dive a little bit deeper into some of these dynamics of your story, especially the ones that don't get talked about a lot. So I really appreciate you coming on, Ann, and sharing some time with us. Everybody was, I should say, we got so much great feedback from your last interview, and I've actually had a lot of requests to have you back. So thank you so much for coming on, hanging out with us today.
Nice to be here. I'm glad we're back together. Anyway.
Same. And so I thought we'd start. Last time you were on, we had a lot to talk about in a short amount of time, and we didn't do too many deep dives into some of the personal details of your story, including your family, which I think is a really interesting part of your story, as you have sort of a more rare family dynamic than a lot of the whistleblowers that have either been on my podcast or who have spoken out, including some of your father's sort of 6 degrees of separation and how that looked for him sort of getting roped into this. So I thought maybe we'd start there and talk a little bit about your
Sure.
father and some of the revelations that you've discovered, and then sort of just the family dynamic and how it differs from a lot of the other survivors that you've seen speaking out.
Sure. You lead the way because it's like I can just answer questions, or I can ramble on about all kinds of things. Because now that you talk about my father, I mean, maybe I could just interject without going off topic that my mother is a huge concern for me, right? Well, a subject. I've moved back to the town where she grew up in southern Quebec, because of this chain of events. My grandfather, when you talk about a special background, it's partly it's due in part to my father having been an Air Force intelligence officer, which brought him into the program, but it's also partly due to my mother's background, which was the only daughter of a French Canadian politician, country doctor, and I swear, in this town, he's considered to be almost a saint. He was, and he was killed in when he was the mayor, and he was also the member of the Quebec legislature parliament. He was killed by a train. I'll send you a picture of the train because I've got some of that background and maybe we can add it. But he was killed by a train in 1940. So this is 11 years before I was born. I never knew him, but in moving back here, which I did a few months ago because of it's a whole story. I'm now kind of absorbing the culture that she grew up in, Quebec, French, Catholic, small town, and she was part of a small town, you could say aristocracy, but she wasn't an aristocrat. Her father was actually from a very poor family, but he's known as, in French they say le médecin des pauvres. That's his kind of nickname here, the poor people's doctor, because he helped people constantly, and he worked all the time just delivering babies in Quebec during the Depression, and when people had no money to pay him. And he's considered like almost he's a figure of, I don't know, you know uh, they adore him here. So I grew up without any knowledge of this because of the division of the language. My mother married an English Canadian military man, our RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, who was also an intelligence officer, who that imposed a whole secrecy on the whole marriage. And she was from a background which is culturally totally different. French Canadian, small village culture. They like to talk and party, and they're very loving. They're Catholic, and my father was an Anglo Protestant. He had a lot of the traits of those Presbyterians. So, that's part of it. Maybe just to let you know that that has defined my life in many ways and made me who I am, because I grew up in the English Protestant world, taking on a lot of their behaviors and values, and not, and speaking the language. But behind me was this whole kind of culture that I wanted to be part of, but I couldn't, which was French Canadian.
Like,
It actually works into this story, but in a way that I could talk for hours. But my there's a kind of there's even some questions about how my grandfather died, my French Canadian grandfather in the town when the train hit him. Was that an accident? People here don't believe it was an accident. They actually think it was an assassination, but they don't
is there any
come
theories
out too much to
of
say it.
why that you've heard? Not to say any of them are true, but have you heard some of the conspiracies that people have said?
Well, even at the school, there's a school named after him. His name was Le Docteur Alexis Boutiller. So there is a school that's for kids with especially kids with learning disabilities or special needs or whatever. And I've been to that school, and there the students do projects on him often. In their history class, they study the history of the town and so on. They sometimes they write papers on him, and the young students have to tell their teachers he was murdered. He wasn't. They do the research and they say it couldn't have been an accident. It had to do with the same reason my father was in Quebec, which was there were Nazi sympathizers here who worked in particular for one political party, which was right-wing nationalist, and had a great, almost hypnotic control over the population for 30 years. And it's called, you've heard of the Duplessis orphans. Well, it was the premier of Quebec. The top guy was Maurice Duplessis. My grandfather was in the opposition. He was in the other party. They rarely were in power because the French Canadians kept voting for this fascist. And during the war, he began, and before the war, he began corresponding with some of Hitler's people, like von Ribbentrop, and he wrote letters, and they were going to, and that's probably why Nazi scientists and doctors began arriving here early on. So my grandfather, being a doctor, but on the other side, a liberal, not was in opposition to that, and would have been seen. There was a period during the Second World War when another politician, at least one other, was assassinated for being anti-Nazi, for sort of a high-profile politician. So my grandfather, his death came shortly after that. And I'm sure my mother and others said, well, it was an assassination. They're targeting the politicians that are, that are opposed to the secret agenda here, which the Vatican, was also behind. So it's a nest of worms. But my father, whose name was Donald McLean, he came, I have been told, he never told me this, but I have been told by people kind of, whatever, I've been told, he came to Quebec as an RCIF intelligence officer, but he was investigating Nazi spies, of which there were many operating in Montreal. There were nests, they say, of spies who really were taking orders from Hitler and the Vatican. And my father came in order to help find those. I met some people who also were involved in that work. So I think it's, and so it may be the reason he met my mother, that he contacted the daughter of a politician who they figured had been assassinated by some of these spies. So it's a plot. You see how that kind of, it's kind of a very dark and deep kind of thing that no one could talk about. I mean, when I was growing up, I never heard a word about any of this. I heard things that it's secrets, state secrets. So.
And you see too how even, if it wasn't directly that, say, a family member was in, say, like MKUltra, you kind of see how something can generationally sort of make this web to where
Yeah.
eventually it gets down to a certain generation, and all of a sudden, all those generations before, all these little connections weave closer and closer, and then a generation all of a sudden gets targeted for these programs, you know?
Or the dog. Yeah, exactly. It might start out as something completely like legitimate and good, you know, that, and then it becomes twisted because of the character of some of the people, like Dr. Cameron, what he was willing, who was he working for, what was he willing to do in order to get power. And so, or and the people around him who are often, 33rd degree Freemasons, so on, who were already part of a secret club and who didn't have the best interests of humanity in mind, really, but they might have passed themselves off as, saviors too. You get into a world, a really ambiguous kind of landscape of where you really have to look carefully at what did people do, what did they know, and why did they do it. So yeah, at some point it became, Cameron went to Nazi Germany right after the Second World War. Right after the Second World War, he went to Nuremberg. He testified in the trial of Rudolf Hess. So he was my child psychiatrist, along with the guy he went with was Nolan Lewis, who was from the New York Institute of Psychiatry. So these two men traveled to Nuremberg in 1945, evaluated Rudolf Hess. At the same time, they learned a lot of Nazi medical techniques and psychiatric. They learned that there was a whole new field that opened up because of the concentration camps, and they could access Mengele's documents then. Which they did, because Mengeles files disappeared right as soon as the Americans got hold of him. They had him for a while. They captured him and they released him. His files disappeared. I think he bought his freedom possibly by giving over his files to the CIA. Well, it was the OSS then, So I don't know if I'm going way off track now. It's not. This is just some historical background. But then once the CIA, OSS, CIA, and the doctors associated with the military, who were supposedly anti-Nazi, fighting the war. So once they had that information, it's like, it's like the tree of, the tree in the garden of good and evil. What is, the poisoned apple. I mean, they had the ability to program people. They had more ability than they had before, because they actually were supporting Mengele too. I mean, some of his research was supported by the Rockefellers too. So, they were always open to that type of mind control research. But suddenly they had more tools at their disposal that he had and others had developed in the concentration camps. So they had that given to them. It's like a weaponized psychiatry. They can turn it on their own populations in order to, win the Cold War, whatever reason they want to give. So
Wow.
there's some background.
Thanks for sharing that. And maybe we'll dive a little bit deeper into that too, as we are sort of talking about the landscape of Canada, because I want to get into that too after we talk a little bit about your family and, talk a little bit about what you've discovered about your country and how it can be a puzzle piece for people all over the world who have, been in MKUltra or, are studying it. So I definitely want to talk more about just the history of your culture too. But let's talk about your father a little bit, because I think from what we've been able to piece together from your story, it seems like some of the connections that led to you being put in these programs started maybe with your grandfather, and then through that, your father had connections being born into his family, and then it kind of trickled down into, like you said, something good, like somebody actually having a career and being connected to good people, to it being, connected to people that were being brought in that were very corrupt and that corrupted something good. And then it reached you, and this sort of took on a life of its own, and giving you
Yeah.
this, sort of heinous childhood. So let's talk a little bit about the connections that your father had to these different industries, whether it be military or music, and how that sort of might have created more connections that eventually trickled down to you and your brother.
Sure. Okay. Again, it's filling in background, and I don't want to bore people too much, but there is something really interesting in that my dad came from, you could say, a more rural part of Canada, but he had, anyway, he had musical ability, and his whole family were quite musical. They would sing in church, then four-part harmony. So they were kind of liked in their little village in Ontario, kind of they like to entertain. So then my father, in his 40s, enlisted in the Air Force, Canadian Air Force, and was too old for service in Europe. So they put him in intelligence work, and he had these, the musical ability. He was a school teacher too. And so he had some kind of education and training. They put him in intelligence work. And then, okay, he came to Montreal in 1942, I think, end of 42. And that Montreal at that time, even during the war, it was the entertainment capital of Canada, but also it had a really strong jazz scene. I mean, that was recognized outside, so there were he knew some jazz greats, but when they were really young, they had just maybe signed a contract to record for CBC or whatever. It's like Oscar Peterson, he knew him. I don't know if he even taught him some things. And my father played piano. Peterson played piano, right? And he also knew Maynard Ferguson. So I don't know if these names mean anything to you, but Ferguson, I think, was a saxophonist, jazz, So another jazz star, when you say the name, people have heard of they've heard of these people. So my dad kind of, in arriving in Montreal, he would have been, a single man. He was kind of moving around the clubs and may have been even performing. He never told me, or he may just have been kind of surveilling this scene, which was, mafia. I mean, there was a lot of, money involved in it, and organized crime was involved in those clubs and all kinds of stuff. Corruption, prostitution, so that was the scene in Montreal. It was really a kind of like sin capital. And that gave the city a lot of energy. So it was exciting. The fact that everything was open and everything was happening. So, for a country boy. So then he met my mother, and then eventually they married in 1944. So, okay, my father, I don't know, because when I was growing up, he was so, busy teaching. He around 1948, he got a job teaching high school music in a school that was a stone's throw from the Allen Memorial Institute, where Dr. Cameron was already installed, was already brainwashing people, was already doing experiments on people, but without the CIA being involved. And so 1948, my father started teaching in this high school called Baron Byng High School. It's kind of a famous place in Montreal because a lot of people who are famous came out of it, famous in Canada mostly. Not Leonard Cohen, but some people, important in Canadian culture. It was a big music school, and what I realized when I looked up, Baron Byng. Who was Baron Byng? He was a Governor General of Canada, but he was a British general who had served in England I think in India and South Africa or someplace, I forget. He had at the turn of the century, like in the turn of the early 1900s, and they named the school after him because the other thing about him was he was the originator of the music hall tradition programs in England that became very important after the war and between the wars, because in England, the psychiatrists who were dealing with the shell-shocked soldiers coming back from France and so on were looking for ways to heal the population. And especially after the Second World War, music halls had always been important in England, right? Music halls, people love to go out, they drink in the pubs, but they go to music halls, they dance, they sing, they, listen to music and so on. And the Beatles came out of that. They came out of the music hall tradition. So Baron Byng was one of the initiators of this whole program in England, which is kind of, a socialist type of program to in a way to heal the country from because they want everybody be ready for the next war. They don't want them to be totally wiped out and traumatized. They want to, so the English put a lot of energy into that type of thing. And that's where some of the music comes from. They're a musical, social people. And so where am I going with that? So my dad taught at the high school. There's a big music program at that high school in the late 40s and right through. My father was a music teacher. So he trained choirs at that school, and they had recitals and they put on, operettas and so on. So it was that was his world. And I grew up kind of knowing he was doing that. And I ended up also years later in 1964, going to that high school for a year and feeling like I was just in heaven with this the culture there. It was mainly Jewish, it was Greek, it was there were Moroccan immigrants, people who had lived through they had to flee Morocco there because they were Jewish and they ended up in the school. It was half French, half English. I was just in heaven there. And my father had also taught there. So the principal kind of, took me aside and said, I know your dad. He was the military guy too. So there was all of this kind of was at the time of the Beatles arriving. The day that I started that high school, the Beatles came to Montreal and played the Forum, and did their first concert. One of the first in North America. And then 6 months later, the Rolling Stones came, early 1965. They started their North American tour in Montreal. Why Montreal? I don't know, because I think, in my opinion, there was some connection there with the Air Force, McGill, MKULTRA, Tavistock, all of that was also based in Montreal at that time. So my father being somewhere connected into this program, but his main concern was, earning a living, raising a family, and keeping his music alive in some way, working with music. So this is part of, and that's why I think I may have met some rock stars as a child in the program, Sub Project 68, or some other thing that was going on at McGill in the Allen Memorial. They talk, some other MKUltra or pre-MKUltra or whatever, something I was in that involved getting kids together, training them in different kinds of things. I think there were some kids from England there, and some of them were designated future musicians and celebrities. And I knew them, I was 5. I wouldn't have known. I have no idea what I was part of. And they were older. So that is, you see, people have been telling me, you're crazy. You're talking about the Rolling Stones all the time. You think you met I think I did, but I didn't know it, partly because nobody told me, because partly also they weren't the Rolling Stones, yet nobody had heard of them. And they weren't even playing music yet when I met them. It's all in that embryonic early time. And then it grew. And since I was like a little kid, like one of the littlest, I don't have the least memory of any of it. I wouldn't know anything. So that is, I think, my story in a way, in a nutshell. As I was put in a program, I was too young to remember anything. I have complete amnesia for so many things. And if I was put in satanic ritual experiments, I have fragmentary flashbacks of maybe things I witnessed, but very little compared to other people who've been flooded, with memories, or who were old enough maybe to also kind of witness and know what was going on. I was kind of this, little kid on LSD. So.
And so, what have you been able to put together as far as how did your parents potentially get coerced or fooled into putting you into this program? Do you have any idea how it was
Yeah.
presented to them?
Yeah, I think it was completely a matter of, flattery, feeling flattered that their kids were of interest. There was also some coercion and blackmail. If you don't give us your kids, if you don't let us, study your kids or work with experiment, I don't know if they use those words. If you don't give us your kids, you won't have that good job at the high school anymore. You'll be unemployed, right? You won't be able to support your kids anymore. So what would you choose, given, you're given, that's what life is all about, often it's about impossible choices that you're offered, where you must do something. And I think for my father, that was, it was coercion. I think for my mother, it was more a kind of feeling my kids are special and they've been recognized and by these important people and a feeling of, oh, my daughter could have a wonderful life in England. Like My Fair Lady. I really think my mother was more prone to those kinds of dreams and imaginary scenarios, but not because she was, stupid or anything. It was just that she wanted those kinds of things for us. And I think that combination worked for a while until and they overlooked some signs that it was not a good thing. We were not in something good. They went along, they were persuaded or, told, well, your daughter's not coming home tonight. She's or something because she's in a special party or I don't know. I can only imagine. And or she'll be late or because I was sent down to the hospital to either, be with mental patients or be part of be drugged and electroshocked or sent to parties in mansions, great mansions, where I was kind of being used as for pornography or something, because people have told me they saw me in those situations. But and then I would come home with no memory of the whole event, and I could develop that, how that worked, I mean, how they might have done that. I mean, I know that do you want to hear? Like, for example, ballet, how my mother was manipulated. Well, she was told it'd be nice if I could take ballet after school in second grade. And there was a class, I think it was every week, maybe every 2 weeks. So she enrolled me in ballet. She said, it'd be good for your posture. You don't have to be a ballerina, but you'll have more poise and confidence. Or she was thinking like that. So she put me in this ballet class. And I remember very clearly the name of the teacher, how she looked, what she looked like, the other students. And there we were, it was after school. I remember the first class. I remember all the positions, first position, second position. I learned arabesque and we learned some of those things. So I might have attended 2 classes, enough to get some basics in the beginning. And then at the end of the year, they put me in the recital. And I had no idea of the routine, and I just went, I mean, I don't know even why. They gave me a costume and little slippers, and I hadn't worn any of those slippers all year. And suddenly I'm in there and I'm on stage with these other girls. I have no idea what we're doing. I'm trying to follow. They put me in the back. I was the tallest, of course. And my mother's in the audience, just, like dying of embarrassment. And this would be in like March or April or something, after the whole year. And she takes me home and goes, well, next year you can take piano lessons, But she had no idea why. I mean, why is her daughter so clueless? How can her daughter be this, Well, the reason being, I attended 2 classes of the whole year. And then I have no memory of any other classes, even though those first 2 classes are very vivid, right? I do remember them. I can still do the little steps that I learned in the first 2 classes, sort of. But after that, nothing, because they would use that. They would it would be an after school, extracurricular thing. And then somehow they would get me downtown. They would take me on the way out, maybe on the way out of, second grade. And I don't know, transport me down to the hospital where my report card for that year shows I missed exactly 100 days out of 200 school days, exactly 100. So I was gone all the time. And then years later, I'd meet people, including Leonard Cohen, who knew me from those days. They knew me as a little girl who was what? I don't know. I don't know what I was doing, but there's something sexual in it for sure, because of the kinds of things people, would say. So, and whatever else, and mind control, and the fact that I have amnesia. I mean, I have amnesia except for a few little things that do, come back.
Do
Like
you
walking into
remember?
a room. What?
I was gonna say, do you remember anything of where you were? I know you said that you were taken out of the class. Do you remember anything that they were doing, or were they testing you
No,
or training you?
no. And so this is very suspicious to some people, but I have things like fragmentary memories coming, like I've had that I walk into a room and this little girl and I look around and I say, where's my father? You know? and I wake up from this, it's kind of a flashback, and they're kind of, it's something dark about the situation, I don't know. And I've been, my sources, I mean, it's very easy to imagine how in the second grade, it would be very easy. I could even have taken the bus downtown myself and been down there in half an hour, because there was a bus line just right across the street that would take me to McGill, almost to McGill. Or they could have picked me up, and transported me. But the thing is, I'm only speculating because I don't know. But I do know that later in life, I met people who said, I remember you from McGill. I mean, I didn't go to McGill. I never went to McGill. She said, yeah, of course, we were all there. We were all in, we were in that program. I had people say that to me in the 70s, and I thought they were crazy. But I met a number of them. They all knew one another, and they would talk about it among themselves. They were, it was a scene kind of. So I just didn't, and they would look at me like I was crazy because I didn't remember. Well, I think if you're 8 years old or 7 years old, and I think your brain is much more easy to program, and I think amnesia would be easier to create in a child, because I had no social network to remind me, like, whoa, we just did that experiment down there, where I feel that these guys that I knew later, it's mostly men, um, who were filmmakers, who were, poets and artists and so on, and uh, they could converse about those things because they had a kind of shared, social context that I didn't have, because I was a one little kid. Well, actually, there was another girl from that school, and she remembers going down there, and she was my best friend in second, third grade. So I mean, she has photos. She has photos of herself at the Allen Memorial. She was absolutely in that program, and she didn't want me. When I was transferred to another school, I was sent then to a more distant school, and I don't think they could access me that easily. I remember she hugged me. Please, let's be best friends forever, forever. And I didn't really know why, But she was very musical. She had a beautiful singing voice. She was obviously talented, and she went on to join a cult, to sing, so there are these, that's the kind of confirmation I will get for the to compensate for the fact that I was clueless, really, except I can point to these records, and I can point to a few things. Does that
So
help?
what age were you put into, or I should say maybe tested for or recognized as being, say, a gifted kid, or a kid that would advance into like a gifted and talented program?
I would guess around 3.
Okay. And what do you
Yeah, but
remember about that
I think there
pathway?
was I've had a flashback to playing with blocks, and there was a woman psychologist or something, and I was playing with blocks, and I was kind of, around age 3. But it's a flashback I had. My mother likely could have been talked into bringing us downtown to be tested. She brought us down to see a famous photographer, well, a local photographer, to get a special photograph taken of my brother and me. So we had, sort of, it was kind of the elite that went to this photographer, and I think around that same time it's almost like she might have been taking us around and introducing us, and just trying to make something happen, because we were living in military apartment and a housing, in a kind of bleak area, with other families whose kids were being inducted into these programs too. Because I met them, later in life. I met these people in that same neighborhood. It was absolutely military. It was right near an Air Force base and so on. So I think my mother, to kind of compensate, to fight against the bleakness of her life in this part of Montreal, that she might have just wanted to promote us in some ways, make good things happen, and talk to important people.
Absolutely. And what do you remember about the gifted and talented program? And was your brother, you had a twin brother, was he also in that with you? Did he follow that same path?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he was very musical. He had kind of an unusual, well, he sat down at the piano at age 5, and he just started to play.
Wow.
So I felt like he was I think he was kind of more gifted than I was, actually, but he was musical. So that kind of, that I think that was considered to be special, and, but he was also very sensitive. So, okay, you asked what do I remember? I just remember my mother saying, in my hearing, people said, oh, you have such nice children. They're so polite. They're so good looking or whatever they said. They complimented my mother on us. We were like little. And I remember her saying, yes, and there are some people who are very interested in them. They think that they're special. That's what I can say that's a memory. That's a clear memory that I have. And oh, really? But I didn't know what it was referring to. So it's not like I remember being, taken down. But how I was taken downtown, the first time that I do remember was I had pneumonia. My mother was, it was the middle of winter. It was January. It must have been like 20 below zero. There were snowdrifts in the street. And I was 3 going on 4. And the ambulance came and they put me on a stretcher and they put me in the back of the ambulance. That's a memory I do have. And I think that's how, okay. And then once I was in the ambulance, my mother wasn't there. I was alone. I was being rushed downtown to McGill, to the Royal Victoria Hospital. And that's knowledge I have because of the family telling me that's where I was. The Royal Victoria Hospital didn't have a children's ward. I should not have gone to that hospital. I should have gone to the children's hospital, but I went to the Royal Victoria. And then I remember, and it's absolutely clear that I was lying in the back of the ambulance, and there was an attendant, and he wasn't a nice person, and he put a mask on my face, and it smelled of ether. It's supposed to be an oxygen mask. And I know it was ether. I don't know how I know it's ether, but I smelled it. I was 3.5 years old, but it was like a gas. And I pulled the mask off, and he stared at me and kind of like frowned at me and put the mask back on. And then I passed out and woke up in a bed downtown. And I don't know how much time had passed, but I had pooed in the bed, and the nurse was like this turd lying next to me, this black thing, and the nurse came, and I remember that, waking up to that. It was on the nice white sheet, and she was angry and she changed it. But my mother said, and I don't know if I really remember this, but my mother said, I came to visit you. That same week, my mother had a miscarriage, and she was in the hospital building next door, also the Royal Victoria Hospital, where they had a women's pavilion. And when she recovered from the miscarriage, this is horrible, she came to see me, and I was strapped to the bed, and I was delirious, and I didn't recognize her. So she spoke to the nurse, and the nurse, the nurse sort of covered up or something, or I don't know, tried to reassure her. But why is my daughter strapped to the bed, and why does she not recognize me? Well, in later, whatever. My mother told me that story. She said, I was so frightened to see you, and you didn't know me. So later, much later, when I began working with these remote viewers who came, and they were giving me back these scenarios from childhood and events like the children's party. They completely remote viewed that. They told me about that. They told me about the nurse. And then actually the nurse came through. Her name was Shirley. And she said, I have something to tell Anne. My name is Shirley. I was the nurse. When you were there, you were in the program. We tried with the other kids, because I was in a ward with other children, but officially there was no children's ward there. I was told years later, no children were supposed to be there. She said, you were with the other kids, and we tried to mitigate what Dr. Cameron was doing. We tried to stop him, but we couldn't. And then she went on to say, and she said, she said, on my way to work at another hospital, she lost that job. She had to work at another McGill hospital. She was run over by a car and killed. Hit and run. That's how she died. So in those days, so this is 1955, in those days, you could be killed. You could end up dead talking if you talked. That did happen, So there, I'm just telling stories, right? But how I know that, well, I know part of it, you see, part of it through my mother, part of it for being told by a friend of the family also that you were there, you were in that hospital, your mother was there, you were there. It was a terrible time, and we took care of your brother while your mother was sick and all that. And then, later, many years later, someone, these remote viewers going there and filling in more of the story.
Wow, that is really I mean, it's scary to think that all of that stuff was happening to you in facilities and around people that probably looked safe, on the outside, hospitals and schools. These are places that people drive by, they're right out in the public. It wasn't like, I'm sure that you were taken to remote locations, but I think that that's part of this big deception is people can't fathom that how close this is to home, that their kids could be going to school with other kids who are being taken out of their ballet class and taken to separate locations. And, this happens so close to so many of us, and we're just so unaware of it because it's so sophisticated how they move these kids around and even how they fool parents and teachers and people close to that fire don't even know that it's happening. The other children in school don't even know that it's happening to their own classmates.
No, we didn't know. I mean, I didn't know. I just, that's it. And people are very prone, I don't know, to follow orders. Oh, take this child. She's special. Take her here, and or she won't go down that hallway. She'll go the other direction and out the door. And nobody says anything, and then there's a car waiting or something. I mean, I don't know. Or maybe I'm programmed to take the bus. I mean, really, you can speculate, you can make a movie around it, but of all these little moments in the process where people just they're not thinking. I mean, they switch off, and then they can't, I mean, and then they can't say anything. Then there's often, like, say, my mother, she didn't question me about the ballet. She was so shamed by this experience, and I was ashamed, but I was also clueless. She didn't say, how did that happen? Why didn't you know that? She just tried to get, overlook it, move on. I guess my daughter is a little, is a little bit stunned, or something. I guess there's something wrong with her. She's not going to be a ballerina, but I mean, so no one asked me, and I've only figured it out. I can only figure it out now by going back there and thinking, wait a minute, I remember the first two classes. Like, what happened to the rest of the year? Well, later people told me you were down at the island, you were down at the parties.
So,
Trafficking, child trafficking. That's how you do it, right?
right. And so, what else do you remember about the gifted and talented program? Do you remember being tested at all to get into it?
No,
Do you have any memories of being in it?
no, I don't have class. I mean, you say, I think you've had people on who remember what they were put through and the different. I think what I ended up in was being in a mental hospital where experiments were going on patients and where anything could happen. And I was just present rather than actually going through any form of training. And I'm not sure why that's the case, but it's more like I was in some social scene. And there were, okay, in that mental hospital, and this is a fact, there were a group of young men who were geniuses. They would be usually 7 years older than me. I knew some of them or met them later. They were younger than Leonard Cohen, but he was there. He was writing poetry. He was being, I think, programmed. They were somehow programmed to write. And that was their training. They were also being trained. Okay, they told me they were trained in ESP and various kinds of psychokinesis, different. And I had one of them who was he had an IQ of 180, and he's a story in himself, but he used to tell me about that. And he said we were in that program. Well, I guess I was there, but I was like a little girl, and they were 12-year-old 13-year-old boys, so it's different, a different situation. And they learned mind reading techniques. They could demonstrate, they could move objects, they could you know and Leonard Cohen had those abilities too, special abilities that were like ESP at a level that you know kind of like militarized level where, it's from a training and probably from trauma-based training to make, like, they could read your thoughts. They could, yeah, do these things. Go out of body, astral travel, do all these things. And I used to hear about it from this friend. He was Kenneth Hertz, and he had been in the program from the age of 8 because he was diagnosed as, he was, he was a genius. He had an IQ of 180, and then he published a poem in the New Yorker at the age of 8. And so they picked him and some other guys who were, I can name them. I mean, some of them became kind of poets around town. They would perform in bars, and they would publish little books. And Henry Moscovich, he was a close friend of Leonard Cohen, but he was younger. And there were different, there was a number of these people I just knew as poets, but it turns out they knew me. They knew me from when I was a little girl. And they would kind of sometimes, slyly refer to that. So as I would meet them, later when I was in my 20s, 30s. So I think as a little girl, I just kind of sat there and observed and wandered around and had a kind of little, like princessy aura or something. I don't know, because when you're that age, I mean, what can, and I don't know what else, but for sure there was a training program, and they went into it, and then they might get bounced out of it by taking too many LSD trips. And in one case, at 15, Kenneth Hertz got kind of kicked out of the program because he was psychotic. I mean, had so many of these trips, out of body, trips and so on, that he couldn't function anymore. And they said, you got to go. So then he had to rebuild his life from scratch, kind of downtown. And he was so brilliant, So he kind of recreated himself as a poet and a publisher, and he ran a bookstore, and he did all these things. I guess he was actually being given some of these resources to be an agent, basically, is what he became. An agent. He took notes on everyone. So these stories, I can give you the overview of how it worked in that one city. And we knew one another. And you didn't guess all the time what you were part of. I suddenly, one day, for example, one day, and like in the 80s or something, or late 70s, he pulled out this notebook that he kept in his pocket all the time, and where he would write down, if you have a conversation, he loved to talk, and he asked questions all the time. And it was a little annoying, but you'd meet him on a street corner and he would ask you all these questions. Then he'd go off and he'd write down everything you said. So he had notes on me going back years or months, years or whatever. Did you know that on such and such a date you said this? He had a photographic memory. That was the other skill that they trained them in. Photographic memory. And what he was doing was actually going around town talking to people who had been in this program or other people, and making and creating files on them. And that was his job. That's all it was one thing he knew how to do. Having, missed
That
out
has to
on
be
that.
interesting for you to look back and be like, oh my gosh, that wasn't just a random encounter. There was a reason why these people were placed in my pathway.
They would recognize you. They kind of, one of them I know, well, just through the grapevine, the people would find out about you. You just run. It was that kind of neighborhood, that kind of community where you just kind of ran into people, you talk to them, people revealed things, and then, but one guy was a filmmaker, and he just stopped me in the street one day and said, I know you, and I think it was like that. He kind of recognized me. It's partly about being very tall and recognizable, And
Wow. Those are like
the
I said, that
scene,
has to be like
1970, early 1970s. He drew me into the scene of filmmakers, all these people. They all knew, they partied together like nobody's business. I mean, they would have these huge parties in lofts and so on. And that's how information gets passed around too.
absolutely. Can you
The
talk a little
arts.
bit for people who don't live in Canada, or if they're even if they do live in Canada and they're just not familiar with this information, could you talk a little bit about McGill University, Dr. Cameron, and kind of the history on MKUltra with uh, that sort of circle of people and the university.
Like what? I'm drawing a blank. Where would I start? Um, you mean where did it come out of? Well, McGill was in the 1930s was a pioneer in experimental psychology. McGill University had one of the first department in North America or something, or maybe the world, of experimental psychology, which meant that sort of implies that they were already interested in people and were experimenting, right? So that, and I think it has to do with it's Montreal being the kind of place it was way up north, away from everything and yet close to New York, you know, under another kind of government than the United States, under very much under British rule, and sort of that type of Canadian, conservative or whatever, but another system of thinking, right? So, and a kind of a provincial backwater too at the same time, and a center for immigration. A lot of people coming, for example, tons of Holocaust survivors just flooded into Montreal after the war, and it was always, yeah, and the Irish, immigrant during the potato famine and after there was. So it just had this history that made people, I don't know, they were both intelligent and they're kind of like the most personable people in Canada are from Montreal in a certain way, the most sophisticated, you'd almost say, because of the mixture of cultures and so on, English, French, Jewish and so on, Irish, the Scots did the building, they created the institutions. So it was just this kind of melting pot. And it created a stylish population, and they were, cultural and so on. And it was kind of special. But at the same time, it was also a bit of a backwater. And people are naive and they obey government in Canada. So I think it was just ideal for setting up a program like that, and so when Dr. Cameron arrived in 1943 or 243, they set up this institute. It was always a military program, the psychiatry at McGill. The Allen Memorial Institute on the hill behind McGill was in an old castle, called Ravenscrag, that was built by a Scottish robber baron. I mean, Sir Hugh Allen. I mean, he was totally, involved in the bringing immigrants over from Ireland and Scotland and building and building railroads. And that's how Canada was. It was always an oligarchy kind of society. So his mansion got handed over to McGill during the war by his son, and became this institute, but with the influence of the U.S. and Canadian military, because it was the war, and they wanted to make the Allen Memorial into a center for research, because they were weaponizing psychiatry. They realized they had to get into this field of, controlling people through their minds. So they brought in Cameron, who had a background trained in Scotland, had a background in Manitoba, experimenting on people in Manitoba. And they kind of let them, they gave them carte blanche, I think, and so that's how it had a lot of prestige around it. I mean, when you see it from a distance, you go up the hill and it's on this mountain full of trees and foliage and so on, and this castle, this stone castle, and you think you're in, you've arrived. I mean, you're in Edinburgh or someplace, and it was an extension of Edinburgh, London, had a lot of prestige around it. So that's kind of, Montreal people would be kind of in awe of that, that kind of presence. So
That's always interesting to me too, to hear about these. I mean, there's a lot of universities that have come up just on my podcast where these programs have been, and that's another place that people don't expect that something like this could happen, or, that there's children being brought to a university or, an institution.
It's a
Um,
compliment, right? Yeah.
yeah, 100%. And so what do you remember about going to um, McGill University? What types of things were they? I mean, you mentioned the psychiatry aspect. What types of things were they testing people for? And what do you remember them using you or testing you for there?
I don't remember any testing. That's the it might be the strange thing or something. I don't remember going there. I don't remember going there. See, I think because um but I've had my own flashback. As I say, I have these flashbacks. So one of my flashbacks is that I'm a 4 or 5 year old girl child, and I think I'm naked, or close to naked. I'm lying on a table, and there are doctors around me, about 5 or 6 white-coated doctors, and they're talking, and I'm hearing the conversation, and they're discussing. Well, they've already given me an electroshock to the heart, and they've noted that it stopped my heart for a short time, for a moment or two, and they're talking about whether they should do it again. And I hear them say, but it could kill her, you know, and and then they do it again. I mean, they do it again, and I wake up, but I mean, my body. I was in bed in Greece at the time, and it was a dream. I wake up, but I mean, I've kind of lifted off the bed. I mean, it shocked me. I wake up with a start, but it feels as I'm lifted off the bed for a second there. I mean, it was that vivid a recollection, right? I mean, a flashback. And for me, that's that would be the best example I can give you, the kind of thing I think they were doing. I mean, I don't know that I was given the type of. I think likely I was placed in sensory isolation, and one reason why I think that is that years later, Leonard Cohen told me he had been in these flotation tanks at McGill on LSD. I don't know how that subject came up, but he said, I loved those flotation tanks. Do you remember that, Annie? Do you remember being in those? And I said, no, of course not. I was never on LSD and flotation tanks. Like, I had no memory of it. And he just kind of, nodded. And so later, again, through the remote viewing, coming back on it through these people, we talked to kids who were in those tanks and told us, we talked to kids that'll throw people, but I had these remote viewers would just spontaneously go into these sessions and start with no preparation from me at all. They just spontaneously would suddenly be in a laboratory with children, talking to them about what's going on, and they would describe things like these sensory isolation experiments. And that's for some people that's a bit of a leap. That seems like that's a little crazy. But that's how I found out some of this stuff, also through research. But some of it was just observing, being part of a group of remote viewers who had come together because they said they wanted to help with this research. They didn't know anything about it to begin with, but they felt a desire to be part of this. And they would come up with these amazing scenarios, channelings and different kinds of just extremely detailed information. Some of which I could then, go and check. I could fact check it. I could look it up and find out that they were always accurate. Years, the time frame, the names. I had names of children, for example. I looked up their names. I looked up a couple of names in the city archive and found them for those dates. They had died they had obviously died in the experiment at McGill, young.
How many
I mean,
children?
it was recorded in the city archives that they'd been in an experiment at McGill, but you could say their dates coincided, you know what I mean, and the names.
How many children were typically there with you, and what do you remember seeing happen with them?
That again, I can't access those memories myself. I can say via what I witnessed. Some of it is on tape too, the remote viewing. I have one of the sessions on tape, and I have a transcript of it that I can, I will share. How many children? I think there were about 8 to 10 in this laboratory at one time that we visited. They were between the ages of, let's say, 8 and 14, 15. They all helped one another. They were like a little family. They were mostly from orphan situations or broken homes, or something had happened to their parents, or they had different. They would describe different experimental procedures that they experienced, that they were involved in. One, sensory isolation, being memory, being forced to read texts and memorize them, and then spout them out word for word, long texts, pages. And if they couldn't do it, they'd be electroshocked, they'd be punished. Physical, physical training, endurance training, speed, physical strength. For super soldier type kids who are identified as having the ability to become super soldiers. One little girl was in a chair with electrodes. She'd been in that chair for years with electrodes in her head. And the strange thing is that, I don't know if you've heard of Carol Retz. This group at McGill, this group of kids at McGill, Carol Retz wrote a book called A Nation Betrayed, about her training by the CIA. It was the first book I read, I think, on this, way back in the beginning of my research. And I met her also at a conference, and she also would give presentations. So there's at universities with visuals, and she gave a lecture one time, and she describes coming up the hill in Montreal, going to the Allen Memorial. It's 1960. She's 10 years old, I think. Maybe, yeah, around 10, maybe a little older. And she's in a limousine, and they go up the hill. Well, Dr. Cameron would transport people in his limousine, black limousine. I arrived in a black limousine too, according to the remote viewers. Yeah. And Dr. Cameron drove a black, or he had a driver. He traveled around in a black limousine. So she describes being taken up the hill. It was icy, it was winter. So it must have been early in 1960. And the car, the wheel, they kept slipping on the ice, but they made it up the hill. And then she was in this laboratory, in the behavioral laboratory that Dr. Cameron had, in the building with the horse's head coming out, which that was where he had his, it was the stable building converted into in these offices. It's still there today. And in the basement, there were these children living, and she met them, and she said, there's a little girl she drew a picture, is what she has, the little girl in the chair with the electrodes coming out of her head. And then she talks about the other children, that they were orphans. They were permanent residents. And so I think that in the remote viewings, and I only found this later after the remote viewing, and I recognized, the similarity. It's the same scene. It's the same year, because the remote viewers said, we're in 1960. We're at McGill. We're in this laboratory. And then one by one, the children came out of the, someone was a channeler, and he channeled their speech. I'll send you the script. I have the transcript of the whole thing. And they each told their particular story. They were there for, different reasons, they had different abilities. They knew one another. And one thing about them was they really, they tried to form a kind of family-like environment to protect one another. And some of them died, disappeared. So that, again, people say, well, you don't remember anything. Well, no, I don't remember that. But during that session, someone turned to me and said, Anne, were you there? And I just froze. Like, I felt like, the reason for those children speaking to us, I was the reason. I was present for the remote viewers. I was in the room with them. And the reason we went there and saw those children is that I knew those children at one point. I figured that out eventually. It had to be something like that. But I was a weekend child. I was a visitor. See, this sets me apart. I didn't die because I had parents. I had to go home. They couldn't just steal me,
So there's
you
kids
know.
that literally live there. They didn't go anywhere. They were just permanent residents there. There was a girl strapped to a chair. Was she able to get up at all, or she's just
No.
locked into that
Yes,
chair?
one thing she talked about, she would pee in the chair. She would, yeah, no, no, horrible. She said,
Oh,
we said, how long have you been here? She said, I don't know, years.
oh my gosh.
It's horrific. One little at the beginning of that session, a little boy showed up and had no pants on. He had just a little Johnny shirt and he had curly blonde hair and he was younger. At the beginning of that session, he ran up and he said, come with me. I'm going to show you what they do here. And he took us to that little girl and she started to talk. I mean, this is unbelievable. It's not unbelievable. It's completely rational, actually. Everything they said made complete sense and consistent, completely consistent. And the names and so on. And of two of those kids, I looked up the names and they existed at that time.
Was your brother on sort of the same path with him? Do you remember him being there with you, or was he used for different things?
Um, my brother, I think, I don't really know. I don't know everything, but I think it's possible that he dropped out. We were taken in as twins, but he had more difficulty and possibly was made to do something really horrible right at the beginning, and he couldn't recover from that. He was so traumatized that he just dropped out, and they said, he can go. He can't cope with it. And that's what I pieced together, because it seems as though he was not being accessed like he's not being taken out of school. He didn't miss 100 school days. He didn't meet these people downtown years later and they recognized him. He had other things happening in his life that probably were related to a cult that knew about our family, but he was a musician, and anyway, but he was I guess more sensitive in many ways than me, so they chose me. I was taller also. I was bigger. I looked like I could handle it maybe more. So
Could you talk about that event that you and your brother went to? I know there was the PSI cards, the
yeah.
like, games. It's so obscure that you both were there. And so I'm just wondering if other people might have gone through something similar.
Okay, I can describe what, and again, this is from the remote viewers, but I'll just explain. I mean, this is one of the first things that happened when I sat down in 2004, I think, with these people, and they said, well, now we're going to meditate and we're going to travel to where Anne was as a child, and we're going to bring back memories for her. We're going to bring back what happened. And so they kind of do meditation, and all of a sudden, then they just sort of start, because one of them starts, he goes, okay, I see a black limousine arriving at the front door. The door is patterned. It has a rose pattern design on it. Yeah, Rosicrucian type front door of the Allen Memorial. I said that you're with. Then they said your mother is a tall woman with her hair, pulled back in a certain way, and she's wearing a dark suit. That's my mother's suit. I'll send you a photo, and you, Anne, are wearing a little dress with little blue flowers, white with little blue flowers. I go, yeah, I remember the dress. We made that. My mother sewed that for me. I chose the material. And your brother is so cute. He's in a little dark suit with short pants, and it's very hot. It's really hot. And you walk up the steps and you go inside the door, and your mother, and there's a man behind the desk. And he says to your mother, you can't go in. Your children, and there's a long hallway. And he said, I see your mother standing there. She's sort of in shock with it. She can't go to the party. And the little boy and the little girl, hand in hand, walk down the long hallway, and turn the corner and disappear. Now, okay, next person. We're at the party. And there's a little girl on the table. She has a polio brace on her leg, and she's dead. She's lying on a table, and there are other children kind of standing around looking at her. And then over here, there's children, they're playing with these cards, and there's symbols on the cards, and the children you can't see the symbols, but the scientist is holding up a card, and they have to guess what the symbol is on the other side of the card, behind the, and then they said, and I see some older boys, and they're playing kind of rough games, or they're playing games. There's some kind of physical game. What else? It was a room full of kids that just, oh, and Anne, you fell down and you hurt your hand. And there's this boy who's older, and his name is Mike, and he's helping you up, and he's consoling you because you've hurt your hand, it's bleeding, and you're crying, and you're just, you're a mess, and Mike comes and helps you. Got up, and Mike likes to jump. He likes to run and jump and sing, and he's a happy boy, or he likes to be that way. He's like, in the face of something that's just happened, he's being positive. He's trying to give you courage. So it's a series of things like that. Yeah. From another sort. Well, it came to me in a dream. What else happened that day? Well, later, my brother died in 2012, and after he died, I dreamt that we were at that party, and he was put in the box at that party. This came to me like it's my own intuition, and it was after he died, so he was still around, and he was trying to explain why he'd been really depressed for a lot of his life, very depressed. So we're back at the party, and they put him in a box, and they give him a real sword. As the box is as tall as he is. It's a great big cardboard box. They close him in the box, they give him the sword, and they say, when the box is attacked, you will defend yourself. He's 5 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. They take another kid who's maybe an orphan or a Aboriginal, native kid or something, but somebody who's disposable. And they say, attack the box. And the kid attacks the box from the outside, climbs on top or whatever, so tries to break into the box, and my brother uses the sword, and the kid dies. So, and then, you see, the thing about it, from the actual memory of my brother suddenly arrived, I think it must have been after this party, he had a cut on his eyebrow that had to be fixed, and he had broken his glasses. He had a lazy eye, and he needed glasses to correct his vision. And so he'd gone to the party, he was wearing these glasses, and he'd cut his eyebrow. So he always had that scar too. And at that point, I think that was when they said, he's not going to be on the program anymore. He can't cope. So I also think that possibly the reason I'd fallen on the floor and my hand was bleeding, or there was blood in my hand, was possibly because of that having just happened. But, it was rough games. And then at one point in the party, but later, all right, years later, after I had that dream and seen this scenario of the box, I listened to an interview David Icke did with Arizona Wilder. She said, I was in those experiments at McGill. Dr. Wilder Penfield, she took his name as her pseudonym, Wilder Penfield. She became Arizona Wilder. That's not her real name, but she is Canadian. She said, I was in those experiments at McGill, and they would put a kid in a box, and they called it the Jack in the Box game. And one kid would be given a sword, and then another kid would be told to attack the box, and the kid would get killed. She said, that's the game. That was Dr. Penfield, who was this famous neurosurgeon, in Montreal, famous hero of medicine. He was present, and he was the one setting up that game. That's the kind of thing. So then, my mother would have, at the end of the day, my mother would have come, picked us up, we would have been asleep. Probably, and there was LSD, and one of the kids said they give, after every experiment, they give out these candies, and the little kids were stupid, and they took them. They ate the candies. They would take the candies, but we older boys understood that those candies had LSD in them, and we put them in our pockets. But the little kids ate the candies, and so I think likely, because I have no memory of the party, it came, but I remember the dress. I remember my mother saying, "You're going to a party and I need to make you a dress. Let's go buy the material." And I remember choosing the material and she made the dress. And I don't remember ever wearing the dress. See, this is the whole thing. I had this dress, special dress. Don't remember ever wearing it. Why did I have that dress? You go back and you sort of say something's missing from this. I can remember the shopping trip and picking the material. But so that's how the memories come. And I think if you Aneka Lucas, I listened to her talk, and she talks about how the memories they don't come all at once, and they don't come from the same source all the time, but you slowly, through a kind of process, you put it together. What must have happened? So I think we got picked up. We were probably asleep and taken home. And no memory of having been at a party the next day or anything.
Did you ever have any luck talking to any of your family or even your brother? I know that everybody's a little bit different with how they react to this and what they're willing to look at. But did you ever have any corroboration or did your brother ever disclose anything to you?
My brother was first, I think he read my book or tried to read parts of it. I don't think it's easy, like you say, I don't think it's easy to read. And but he figured out what it was about and what I was saying. And his first reaction was, our parents would never have done that to us. They couldn't have done that. That can't have happened. Well, I said, well, they could have been deceived, they could have, in different ways, it could have been done. And he sort of, it's an emotional shock first to hear this, especially from your sister, and how come we never talked about this? But there were other things that he could remember that kind of confirmed my story. And so he supplied some scenarios, some memories, some, like, my father. One of the things that had happened at the very beginning when I met the psychics, right? I met this man named Harley who introduced me to the remote viewers later, and this was in 2003 or end of 2003, I think. And I met him accidentally. Even on he started channeling my father, and my father has a story. I'll tell you, I'll give you 2 hours of my time for free. Your father must tell you the story. So I went and heard the story, but one of the things in that session, as it was 2 hours in his office and I was taking notes, was that your dad had this friend at school, and where he was teaching, and he told me his name. I knew the name, but I didn't remember who he was. But I went to my brother. I said, "What was that dad's best friend's name?" And told me, "Ken Zake." Oh, okay, that's the name, And somehow Harley had picked up that name. He picked up a number of other details like that are just impossible, unless you're actually, just real. And the other really interesting thing my brother remembered, he said, I remember we used to go to the airport, the little airport near where we lived, and we'd watch the planes take off, and we did that often on Sundays. And I said, "What do you mean? I don't remember ever going to that airport, ever watching planes take off." "Oh, come on, we did it all the time. Or we did it fairly often. It was very exciting. There was a frost fence, and we'd wait, and the plane would taxi and take off." This was a family outing that we had? No, I never, and we would have other memories that we absolutely remembered those things in common, but that, no. How come I don't remember that? Well, I think logically, I think it's because I was on the plane. They had gone to the airport to see me off, and I got, put on the plane and possibly in a crate or something. And so my brother was all excited because watching the planes take off. He didn't notice his sister wasn't there. I think that's a kind of likely explanation for that, because I do have memories of being in an underground base somewhere far away from Montreal, and I had to have been flown there, watching children being tortured in, so, and that scenario was, again, it got confirmed. I've always had that memory. I wrote about it. I published a story where I describe it in the 80s. So it's on record that I had that memory from early childhood. But I mean, I can prove that. But in 2000 and something, I found someone who just described exactly the same facility. There was an assembly line, and children were strapped to this belt, and how they were being tortured by doctors. I mean, the woman said it was doctors dressed as witches with these cattle prods. She knew, that's what it was. But for me, I was 4 years old and told my mother I was in this place and there were these children, they were strapped down and and there were witches and they had these long sticks. And, I tried to tell my mother that would be 1956 or something. And my mother said that was a bad dream. But whether she then went to the doctors, my daughter is telling me that, some kind of horrible nightmare that she's having, and whether they decided not to continue because there was some disclosure going on or something, that possibly something like that my mother might have done, and that might have influenced then what happened to me later. Possibly might have kept me out of some really terrible places, because they would be alerted, a little bit. So that's possible, Like I almost feel like I was a little bit lucky or something, not to be pushed into the worst of it, not to be maybe fully programmed. I don't know.
And what about your parents? Did you ever ask them about anything, and kind of what was their reaction to it?
Well, they weren't alive. You see, that's the whole thing.
Okay.
My father died in 1974, and my mother died a few years later, 1980. In 1977, my mother was still alive, and the newspaper began talking about Dr. Cameron because it was coming out in public that there had been the CIA program at the Allen Memorial. And I knew my father had been down there during that period, and I knew he'd seen Dr. Cameron, and I knew that, I recognized some of it. So I asked my mother in around 19, must have been 77 or 78, I remember saying, so what happened to Dad down there? Do you think was he in these experiments? And she just refused to discuss it. She just said, we don't talk about that. I think because she couldn't wrap her mind around it anyway. She wouldn't have. My mother kind of got into a state to where she was an invalid. She was sick. She had this massive, she had rheumatoid arthritis. So she was bedridden. She had so much, I think, so much regret and guilt also, that she just couldn't cope with a situation that was mind-boggling. So I could say that's the only reaction. The other reaction, though, that I did talk to my father in 1963. I was 12. He was back from the hospital. They had brainwashed him. I didn't go into that story this time, but my father was a Cameron patient in 1960, from the end of 1962 to 1963. So later, but we didn't know about the program at all. And we didn't know the extent of it. We just knew that our dad was in the mental hospital, came home, didn't recognize us, slowly kind of recovered a little bit, and went back to teaching, but he didn't realize the whole story. He pretended he was still working, but he wasn't. He was in the day hospital being treated, going downtown every day, and but pretending to us, we were 12 at the time, that he was still working as a high school music teacher. He'd dress up and go out the door and get in his car, and we thought he was going to work, but he was going down to the hospital. Okay, so but I didn't know. And this is also the other story that I was telling the other day. It's not funny, but it is funny in a way. Is he brought home these pillows one day, these foam rubber pillows, and they had speakers in them, but we didn't know. And we began, and also I think he brought home like a bedtime tonic people took in those days. Children would take it. There was LSD in it, because my brother and I both had these hallucinations at night after he brought us these pillows. And I heard a voice coming out of the pillow. It was Dr. Cameron's voice, repeating a message, just like exact word for word what was on one of his famous patterning tapes, where they would play a message, and people would have football helmets and with speakers. They'd put on these football helmets, the patients, and I'm laughing. I'm sorry, but what are you going to do? I mean, this is horrific, but it's the truth. It's what happened. And they'd hear this voice in on a loop. It would repeat hundreds of times, thousands of times. So the message I heard every night for a period in January, February of 1963 was, "You're no good. You will fail. You will never succeed at anything." And I would hear it. Meanwhile, I was hallucinating, having body distortion, like voice. The clock seemed to be talking to the bedtime alarm clock, would tick in a louder, softer, faster, slower. And I was hallucinating. It was LSD. Oh, someone's calling me. I'm gonna have to decline. So, so that, so that was going on. Okay, it was like around maybe March 1963. I do remember I might have been playing chess with my dad or something. We were sitting opposite each other. And he was kind of, he was slowly coming back. And he looked at me and he said, "You know what? They're not doing anything good down at that hospital." And just kind of looked at me. And I went, it's the first time he'd mentioned, anything about the hospital. I went, "But Dad, they just tried to help you." I didn't even know he was talking about now at the hospital. He was more like, I thought he was referring back to the 6 weeks when we knew he had been down there. He was a full-time patient. But he said, and then he just snorted, he kind of, "You don't know anything, but I can't tell you, you know. But so that's where for my attitude as a 12-year-old is like, my dad, he was always so angry, and now he's kind of calmed down. They helped him. He doesn't remember our names, or I mean, when he came home, he didn't remember our names, but he's come back and he's getting better. And I thought of it. I was kind of pro psychiatry because he'd become calmer, but basically he was brainwashed, couldn't work anymore.
What
So
was it
there's
what
those
happened to get
those
him sent
two.
there to begin with?
Sorry.
What happened to him that he was sent there
I
for
don't
that
really
long?
know exactly,
Okay.
but I was told again by, Harley, the remote viewer, the psychic, when he was talking to, I suppose that, he was channeling my dad and giving up this information, including names and dates and so on. And so, he said, "Your dad was being harassed and kind of targeted at work. He had a friend who was not really a friend." And he named the guy, and my brother remember, and I remember the guy too. And he's like, he pretended to be my dad's friend, but it was really a kind of surveillance. And he was actually, he may be the person that caused trouble or something for my dad at work. My dad had a bit of a hair trigger temper. I mean, I don't know if he demonstrated it in public so much, but at home, yeah. So I don't know if he, if that might have got him into some kind of trouble, but he was also very, cool and calm in many ways. He could control himself. So he was definitely not a mental. You wouldn't have said this is a mental patient. This is not a person who has no control over himself. He's a very professional and very clear, very well spoken. But I also think it's possible my mother was talked into having him committed by the psychiatrist because he was very difficult for her to live with at times. He was uncommunicative, he was angry, and we all felt it, and we all felt our dad is really difficult. So my mother may have, at the end of 1962, she might have been convinced by the propaganda that was out there, telling people the Allen Memorial could just fix families that are having members of families who are difficult, who are, they can be helped. We have the techniques, we have the methods to send them home, and they'll be different people, and they'll readjust and become more sociable. And so I think it's highly likely my mother signed a paper and they went to him at work, and they took him downtown and locked him up. I mean, it's fun, not funny. But when I look back, I mean, we weren't told anything. Just, your dad's not coming home. He's in the hospital. And then 6 weeks later, he comes home and he's very frail, kind of uncertain, doesn't really know where he is, doesn't really know us, you know.
Wow. That has to be
So
really confusing, kind of looking back on all of that and just, seeing how it interweaves with your story and being able to
Yeah.
try to speculate those puzzle pieces that go in. Because at the time, as a child, as serious as it is when a parent is gone for a period of time, children are still so young to where they just continue on with life. They're not, asking a
Oh
million
yeah.
questions about everything. And it just sort of like becomes like normalized, and it has to be really crazy looking back and just,
Yeah.
connecting this and being like, oh my gosh, he was a
Yeah.
Dr. Cameron patient. He was at this university. He came back and he didn't even remember us. Like what happened, you know?
You told different alibis. My mother said, well, um, like the following, I think he came back on a Friday, and on the following Monday he got up and went to work after not remembering us on the Friday. But on Monday he was ready for work, but he wasn't. He was going downtown. They lie. The kids are not in those days, especially. I mean, we weren't included in those kinds of discussions or decisions or anything. We were just told a story that probably the psychiatrists suggested would be the right thing to say. So all of this it goes under, the other layer of deception, another layer. So you don't remember clearly because you're not observing in an intelligent way. You're being told a fantasy.
And so when you had started to, let's say, put the puzzle pieces together, I know you don't have all of your memories, so I'm not going to say you remembered everything, but when you
Yeah.
started to put this together and to ask those questions about what you went through, what was that like for you, that process of that realization, and what were some of the first steps that you did? Did you go seek therapy, or did you sort of internalize and stay home and start researching? What was your path like realizing that your life wasn't what you thought it was?
Right. Well, and I think for everybody it's totally different, right? Depending
Totally.
on circumstances. So what happened was it was after 9/11 that had happened in 2001, right? And then a year later, okay, a year later, my teaching contract had ended. I was out in British Columbia, and I was offered a house sitting situation with friends who were going to India for 2-3 months, and I was given basically a beautiful, quiet environment and free Wi-Fi, which are unlimited Wi-Fi, and also I had started to ask the question, what happened to my father in 1962? Plus, I was doing some reading. I'd read a novel about Nazi Germany after the war, and it kind of made me interested. I'd been to Auschwitz in the previous summer and visited Mengele's clinic. So these things were coming from different directions, different kind of stimuli, that were making me ask questions. And then I was starting to do internet research, and then you find things. So it was a slow process like that. For me, it was always about research. It was not about being flooded with horrific memories. I always had a distance from it because I've been told by that I have these memory walls, and they're quite efficient. And I've been told that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes you maybe a little unaware of stuff, but you have protection. You're protected. So I was told, as a result, you're pretty high functioning. You can function. You're. I could teach. I could write books. I could do things like where's the damage? People would say. Well, the damage is emotional. In relationships and. Having a kind of nervous personality, and being skittish and afraid, maybe having some fears I don't want to look at. It's on the emotional level a lot of the damage happened, which is, I guess, true for everybody, right? But the thing is, and also I had this training. It's a little bit of academic. No, I'm not an academic, but I had worked as a journalist for a while. I kind of got gravitated into journalism and worked as a journalist. So I approach things like a journalist. I interview. I ask questions, and I research. So suddenly I had this ability to research 12 hours a day if I wanted to, and I did. I would just read documents. I was kind of I found out about MKUltra early on in the whole thing. I've never heard of it, or if I'd heard about it, I had no idea what it was. and there was on that at that time, 2002, 2003, there was a vast amount of information online. Just you could just click right into it, Google it, and it would just come out of your computer, and you could read. I literally read sometimes from morning till bedtime, all day, nothing else. Documents, correspondence, and eventually I was talking. I contacted a few survivors, a couple of survivors, and asked them. I said, I think I was there. I think my family was involved in this, but and they'd ask questions, and they'd say, yeah, it sounds like you were in it. You were a kid. It sounds like it. And I'd go, no, that's impossible, But my parents would never have put me in something like that. So it's odd, it's like I'm a little bit detached from it all. It's not like I suddenly remembered and was back there. No, I never had the ability to go back there. The remote viewers took me back there, but I was always an observer from the outside of the session. I didn't see what they saw. I didn't see the little girl, but I heard them talking to her, and I recorded the conversation. Because her voice came through a channeler. So Harley had this ability he's a trance medium. He would channel the child. The people in the room who have this talent, right? They could see her completely clearly. They knew. I couldn't see those electrodes coming out of her head. I didn't see that. I didn't see the chair. They saw it. They brought up details about how she was strapped in and various things. But I couldn't do it. I think that's part of the barrier that I have set up some barriers in my to continue to live, So some people say that that makes that delegitimizes what I have to say. Well, yeah, in a way, I'm not a survivor in the sense of maybe the way that people you talk to. I mean, they have those memories, but I've also met people, at conferences who got those memories, and they're on drugs or something just to exist. They can't work. This is going back into the early days when they're flooded and they're disabled. They're on disability pensions and things like that. This was like 20 years ago, nearly now. But I remember thinking, so some people say you could get hypnotized and recover your memories. You should do that. Then other people I spoke to said, no, you should not do that, because they had experience with when that happened. It's not fun at all. You might not be able to ever do anything else. So I chose, in a way, not to do it, not to get hypnotized for that.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I know there's been a lot of survivors on my show that have chosen to do that because I don't know why. Maybe they were ready for it, or it was
Yeah.
just like a quick way to do it. But there's also so many people who advocate against it, and I totally get why, and especially because hypnotism in general was weaponized against you in these programs. It's devastating to learn how these things can be used for bad. That's something that was so shocking to me, to learn that people are using things that we're told are therapy. It's like a therapeutic modality or like an alternative medicine, and it's being used in such evil, cruel, vile ways against you, and so I think that is like a really personal choice, and I do know
Yeah.
people who have had really good experiences and they advocate for it, but I think you really have to be ready for that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And a therapist can re-traumatize, a patient through
Totally.
through going through you know, and it has come up recently because I was talking about the book Michelle Remembers, and that seems to be what happened. That famous book that they say launched the satanic panic and all that, and there's a whole story about it. But the therapist, was he honest, or was he just milking her to make money off the story, or and there's all these different stories. I actually haven't read the book, but I recently saw a documentary on it. It was a pretty bad documentary, but CBC Canada, they try to frame these things. Now it was about a satanic panic and a fraud and a hoax. They're trying to tell people that, but it's pretty clear that she was reliving, and she couldn't stop reliving these horrific events in her childhood that had been repressed before, and they suddenly started coming out. But it was a therapist who died, early, and she's still alive. And I don't know her. I wasn't there. I didn't live there. I was in British Columbia, and but it was another Canadian story about a cult. And then some people say, no, well, that's just, it's just all fraud. Or look what happened to her. You know, he used her. I think there's such a spectrum of, possibilities, and it all comes down to humans and their choices, and what they can handle and their background. And I think if I hadn't been a journalist in college, I would have a different, and witnessing. I used to love to go to events where there were riots or there was trauma, really happening in public, like collectively and so on. And I was very drawn to those kinds of stories. So I don't know, maybe that's why I approach it the way I approach it.
Well, and I think too, you don't have to have all of your memories for your story to be validated. I think sometimes survivors get frustrated and they're like, well, I can't go speak out, or my story it's not going to be valid or credible to other people because I only have these little like glimpses of what I went through, and it's like, you don't need to prove yourself to anybody. Like, you know what you know. When all signs point
Yeah,
to that this is what happened to you, likely that is what happened to you if that's what all the signs point
yeah,
to, especially
yeah,
even if you don't remember, look at all the research you've done on your family and being able to connect, okay, my parents weren't involved, but
yeah,
this person in my life was, there were all these
yeah.
elements that show you that that was a part of your life.
And the memories, yeah, memories come back, and they don't come back in a logical or chronological order. They will come back. Like today, I looked at something, and it triggered a whole memory that actually, it offers some explanation. In fact, that's happened a couple of times, several times, I think, this week. It's just random seeing something, and and suddenly it causes you to put more pieces together. And that, I mean, it's been 20 years. I mean, it's not like I just started this yesterday, and that in a way maybe is one reason why I can tell it, and also I can now tell it in a more, maybe it's more convincing now because I've taken all this time to arrange it in a kind of chronological and logical sequence. I hope it comes through, to when I talk about it. But initially, when these things come back to you, it's like a kaleidoscope of, it seems like you're crazy when you talk about it, and you can't explain, you can't find the logical explanations. So you sound crazy if you can, if you're with unsympathetic people, or, you know. So that's why back in the day in the 70s, when people were talking to me about these things, I thought they were crazy, or I didn't know exactly. It wasn't exactly that. It was that I thought, that's unexplained, and it's a little wonky and a little bit like out there. Is that, and yet I was hearing it from more than one person, just not
Totally.
understanding how it could possibly be real.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah,
it's like it's not the person that sounds crazy saying it. It's what's being said that's crazy because it is crazy. What you and others went through is
yeah,
absolutely insane. It is the most
yeah,
psychopathic, vile, disgusting types of things that a
yeah.
human can ever go through. And so of
It
course
is.
it's going to sound crazy, but in my opinion, when you actually take the time to listen to somebody like you or any of the other guests that have been on my podcast or survivors who have spoken out elsewhere, a lot of them, like you, were recognized as being very intelligent and very gifted, very talented, and having these things that made them excel in different parts of their life. And when you listen to them, they don't sound crazy. Everything that they say makes sense. They don't sound like some crazy schizophrenic person. It's just what they're saying is so inconceivable to somebody who is not a psychopath, who would never, hurt another human. thinking
Yeah,
about that other people are hurting humans on this level is just so unbelievably unfathomable. And so, of
yeah,
course, it sounds crazy because it is, but that should
yeah,
never like discourage people from sharing because I think the more that people do share, the less crazy it sounds. If you're hearing it from somebody other than a survivor, it tends to have sort of like an inverted twist on it where it's more like sensationalized and made to be like entertainment almost like the Manchurian Candidate, right? Like you watch that movie and it's like people look at it like
entertaining.
it's an entertaining blockbuster, but when you hear about somebody that actually went through something like that, you realize like the horror that a child goes through being brought up this way and that this is like the most important thing that we should all be getting behind to stop. You know what I mean? But of course it sounds
Yeah,
crazy. And it's really sad that it does. It's sad that this has been hidden for so long, all these generations, all these decades. And all these decades later, it still sounds crazy to people because they are not exposed to this being a part of our history, that it's just been so covered up, in every
yeah.
country that it's happened in.
Cognitive dissonance. Yeah, and that's why I'm such a supporter of what you're doing, because you are really creating this field, where people can share stories and where it becomes believable because it's just critical mass. I mean, it's just impossible to say all these people are making this up. No, they're coming forward, but they are coming forward. They feel the strength now and the confidence to say it. So I mean, so much to learn.
Absolutely, yes. Very sane people that went through insane things, and I think the quicker that more people do speak up and that we circulate this and you listen to these
Yeah,
testimonies and there's so many things that match up. You're in Canada, people could think like, oh, well, what she went through must have been so different than what people in America went through or people in the UK. And you listen, it's like, no, it's literally playbook. Like it's the exact
it's
same
playbook.
thing.
Yeah.
It's just in a different location. So you see how
Yeah.
this was set up to be, this network and that they strategically picked different areas of the world, whether it was
Mhm.
geography or the types of people that they had access to, whatever it is, you see how this was like very intelligently designed, how all of this was set up, and that it's not just some random crazy thing. It's rooted in science. It's something that's probably been around for a very long time. It's just now more sophisticated where they're studying it and able to analyze it scientifically and improve it, or however, like I hate even saying that word, but, making it even more sophisticated with things that we have now, like technologies and stuff that maybe didn't exist decades ago. And, it's like, why wouldn't our government and evil people try to get their hands on corrupting people and being able to enslave them? Like that is the ultimate thing that psychopaths want is control over people. And who better to
Yeah.
control than small children who don't, have the means to protect themselves from having their free will taken from them. Like it makes perfect
Right.
sense whenever you actually learn and piece together the history and then corroborate it with what happened at these universities and these military installations and all these different places that programming was taking place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And the thing is, they also stated at times what their plan was. I mean, if you really go into the history, or you look into the documents, say you look at the Tavistock Institute. I mean, they stated their intentions.
Yes.
It's like that, but nobody reads. I mean, nobody goes back and looks, and they
Right.
listen to television or they go to football games. But I mean, that's why people think this is ridiculous because they're living a diet of mass media garbage, is telling them this couldn't happen. This Disneyland, like live in a fantasy, watch Disney movies and sort of, talking animals. But yeah, I mean, they've stated it often and what their plan was, why they were going to do this, and then they did it. What more do you want? But, in terms of, yeah. And children, of course, people in Montreal, there's a bit, there's this, I have trouble getting some of the people who were in the Allen Memorial, who were families that were in the Allen Memorial experiments, Dr. Cameron. Sometimes they've told me, well, you have no right to talk because you could not have been there as a child. That story is really hidden and really suppressed. Well, that's because it's more horrific even than the mental patients who were tortured and programmed. That children, this, so absolutely the media will not touch that. but and so they don't hear about it on TV. But also, it just makes so much sense. You program a child and you got him for life, and you can use him. It's whereas a mental patient who might be in their 40s or 50s or something, they're going to die anyway in a couple of decades, and they won't deliver back anything to you. All they can really deliver for you, if you're a scientist who wants to create human robots who are going to work for the new world order or whatever, and be these programmable slaves, you want to get them young. You're investing all this money and time and expertise in them. You are, personnel and all these people. So you don't want to throw that away in a couple of years. You want that asset to be around forever. And so the children, I found, talking to people in journalism, for example, in Montreal, I know some of them were programmed as children. You can just, even one or two have told me they were, but and horrible. Some people, I've heard some horrible stories, but I can tell just by behavior of this media crowd, I can tell they're programmed. But they're the last people to admit it. And just like there's these walls of, denial and amnesia, I'm sure they're at probably the kind of people that were working for the newspaper when I was there, who I think probably had the same kind of programming. They also functioned under an amnesia dome. They followed orders. They did, So all of it makes complete sense.
It does, yes. And I really
Yeah.
appreciate you and all the work that you've done. You were one of the first to come forth and like have the courage to talk about this. And, I don't think we'd be where we're at today with having as much exposure as we do, if not for people like you, Kathy O'Brien's, and, the different
Yeah. And,
Carol Becks and the different people that took
yeah.
that leap of faith and decided nobody else is talking about this, but I'm going to.
Well, and I just want to say, I would never compare myself to Kathy O'Brien. Somehow, it's funny, but I just think she's way ahead of me, way smarter, way above, and also was way deeper into the whole thing, where I was more on the periphery. Like I feel like and that's why another reason why I analyze it from the outside. I don't have the kinds of personal encounters with presidents and and prime ministers and so on that she can recall in detail and give you photographic, like word for word kind of dialogue and so on. No, I'm not at that level at all.
But you still
But
came
I'm a
forth when nobody
researcher.
else was. You still were talking about this when nobody else, had the
I
courage
know,
to.
because I recognize it from the, I could see that I lived as was part of a group because other people who'd been in it had told me early on, and I hadn't understood. I saw myself as part of this collective, my city. I have a really strong sense of loyalty and love for my city and my peers in a way. So that also motivated me to I talk from that angle. And also Leonard Cohen. But Leonard Cohen, it was great. He was kind of a paternal figure in many ways, and he didn't reveal things directly, but I can remember conversations, where he was obliquely referring to things. And then later, when I did the research, I could often refer back to things that he had somehow pointed to in one way or another. He became my model of Manchurian candidate programming or Illuminati. They're being secret societies because, he was often, when I see him, he'd often put on his hat and go out the door, and he was going to some kind of meeting. And he would call me just before he left, and I'd come over and have like a tea or something at his place or something. And I'd see him for a little while, and he'd always be headed out somewhere. I think so things like that come back to me. Places where Buckingham Palace, Hydra, when John Lennon was shot, and Buckingham Palace, the hotel where he stayed, and and where I visited him in 1979, and so on, and what was going on. Things I just like, things that I witnessed that at the time I didn't recognize. I see show me where those connections were in the, for example, in the entertainment business. I could see those connections happening. I'd see the Mossad agent who visited him in Tel Aviv, because I was there too. So, so I had access to someone who was very deep inside the whole thing. And he allowed me access. I don't know why, but I think that it's because part of him hoped that I would figure it out and go, eventually figure it out. And a part of him wanted to expose what he had been through and what people were going through and what he knew, but he knew that he didn't dare do it. I mean, he had children and so on, different things they could have done to him that were, that's the whole thing. There's this control. Once you can get into the mafia, you can't get out. You can join secret societies, but you're not going to get out alive. So he was in that, position where he had to be very cautious and logical and so on. But I could watch it from the outside too. And so I learned so much, I'm very grateful to him for having, and I think it's because he realized instantly that I was who I was. I was this little girl that he'd known in the hospital. Yeah, who he might even have saved my life when I was that little girl on the table. I didn't fill in the rest of the story. But when I said they were electroshocking me, the doctors had were standing around the table, and there was this electroshock, and I had a flashback to that. And years later, I had a friend who was doing meditation in India and different things, and he said, "I'm going to ask the question: what is your relationship with Leonard Cohen about? Why does he have such a powerful influence on your life? Why can't you break free?" Because there was that going on, he really was an influence on a lot of people, but so my friend sort of did a meditation, and the next morning he gets up and says, "Well, I know what happened now." He said, "I saw you on a table and there's doctors surrounding you." I never told anybody that story. It was something that I had remembered, but I didn't talk about it. He said, "I see you're a little girl, and there's these doctors, and they're about to electroshock you, and they're going to kill you." And he said, and then the door opens and this guy rushes in, and it's Leonard Cohen, and he stops them. So I go, "Really?" But it makes total sense. And he's young, he's not the Leonard Cohen I knew later who was in his 40s. This is a young man in a bathrobe, a mental patient who's been passing by and hears this conversation or whatever, knows what's going on in there, and decides, "I'm not going to let them do that to this little girl." Then I bond with him as in childhood. Don't see him for another, I don't know, 20 years or something, meet him again. And he remembers me, but I don't remember anything of it, but he remembers that event. And yeah, so that sort of thing, you have to really look at things, I think, from all these different angles to try to, piece it together.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because you did a great job piecing together what you do know into your book, and I wanted you to talk about your memoir, and the work that you do on Substack, because I think, this is another great way that we can learn from you and keep up with you. And you have so much detail in here that we, haven't gotten to on either of our two podcasts, that people can read more about, things that revelations that you've had and connections.
Well, that book is so long ago now, and I think writers, people who write books, they want to move on, and I think they forget what they wrote, because there's no other way to keep going. You couldn't continue writing if you just always were back in that same rereading your writing, That book, I wanted to find a publisher for, and and it needs an editor really badly. I mean, I think anyone who tries to read it will notice, that nobody edited this book. I was looking for people, for publishers, and the reaction was so scary that I got. It was such an extreme rejection that it just freaked me out, and I just wanted to. I just self-published it. Someone said, "Well, you can just self-publish it on, lulu.com." So it's really what it is. It's my honest, I would say, first or second draft kind of diary of of how I started remembering and what I was remembering 20 years, but this is 20 years ago. And I don't know what to say about it. I don't go back and read it, but maybe I should at some point. If I ever found a publisher, for example, who'd say, okay, Anne, I'll take on this subject and we'll put out a book for you, a real, like edited. And I would have needed a lawyer also, legal opinions on quite a bit of what's in that book, because that wasn't clear what I could say, what I could not say. So I just regurgitated, that's what that book is. And people have read it and they want to talk about certain things and so on. In the meantime, it's 20 years, it's nearly 20 years ago. In the meantime, I've done this additional thinking and realization and learn more things. So I would start I would tell it probably differently now, but it's still there as a document, of a genuine, honest telling of what I knew at the time and what I also behind it all, behind my family's story, there's like thousands of pages of that I had read. Like I had read so much information. I had so much information that I couldn't directly communicate because it was in other documents and so on. I'm not that type of writer, but I could tell the story of a family that was involved in it. So that's what that book is, my Cold War, and that's my cover that I did myself. And nobody would talk to me. I mean, nobody was helping, I tell you. And also, the reaction I got from publishers was, like I say, it was scary. They started treating me like a dangerous lurker, terrorist, somebody they had to like delete me almost from the public record. Like I had these publications and from before, and it's almost like they just kind of decided she's got to be eliminated almost. I felt that they wouldn't talk to me. I go to parties. I was physically attacked. I mean, you could say almost pushed out the door at one gathering, physically pushed out the door. And all I did was, I mean, all I did was submit a manuscript to a publisher, and they rejected it within days. And then it's like I was, I don't know. I was branded as some kind of dangerous person or something. And so I just began avoiding. I moved to Greece at that point. I mean, I had found this new life there, and I just preferred to pull myself away. It could have become dangerous for me. I had a police, informer following me around and calling me up, and different things, started happening. My Writers Association, was basically against me in some way. Were telling people I was dangerous or something. I don't know what they were saying. They still tell people those things. 20 years later, I hear every now and then, and it's because it was a policy. It was a government cover up, and I had unwittingly, transgressed I'd broken the rule by writing about my childhood. That's all I did. So even now, that's still around here, because I do think it all comes out of a program. And I think the program was in London at the end of the war. It was the Tavistock Institute. It's helped to set up the program at the Allen Memorial. And people just kind of follow orders from those days. And they don't know they're following orders. It's done in deceptively, and and I think it's because the program was always to mind control the population. So any whistleblower that shows up, we will crush them, quickly crush them, and it's done in all kinds of ways. So I just the way I coped with it was to pull myself out of everything and just go away and watch from a distance again, try to make sure the story got out as much as I could get it out, and, be patient. It took about 15 years or something before I think I started, my first podcast was like about, the book had been out already for almost 15 years, and nobody had ever, suddenly I was getting asked to do podcasts. It's not like I really tried to capitalize on this, because it was obviously dangerous to be doing it. I hope it changes, but I don't know that it will.
Well, because of you, you and others who have been using your voices for so long, it's made a dent. It's allowed other people to have the courage to come forward. It's legitimized and validated
Yeah,
other stories of people who have come forward. It's provided key details for people who live in Canada, the United States, wherever,
I hope
people have
so.
come
Yeah.
from. It has. It's made such a difference, Anne, and we're all so grateful that you made that decision to come forward because I'm sure it's not easy now to talk about this. I'm sure when you decided to come forward years and years ago, that it was very difficult. I'm sure people looked at you like your head was twisted on backwards, and it's amazing how far we've come and how work like yours is now starting to be more validated than ever, and people are willingly looking into this and researching it, and they're believing it because people
Yeah.
like you came forward and it encouraged
Well, I
other
think
people
so.
to. Yeah,
And that's what I was told, like when I was questioning, whether I should write the book or try to get it, try to bring it out. And someone, and Harley, again, the remote viewer guy, he said, get it out and just get it out and don't, and just put it out there. You're too perfectionist. You will start to, you'll start to gobble it up. You'll start to edit and, change things because you'll be afraid. Don't think about it. Just put it out there. And I took that advice. Just let it be what it is, and because you have to break that barrier and start the process. And he said the main thing, he said, your story will allow other people to tell their stories. So that's the main reason why you should share. It's not perfect. It's not, you don't know everything, but start the ball rolling kind of. So I'm glad. I mean, I'm very happy to hear back, um, from people. And I don't even care if people read it. I think my blog is kind of interesting. So you give them but it's got a lot of like these pieces that I wrote over years. But there's a kind of a the greatest hits are over on the right. Yeah. So you can see that the popular posts, yeah, I think they're interesting. They deserve to be popular, Not
absolutely.
and they're not in the book, there are separate things that happen later that I found out about. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you have this blog which is on blogspot.com, Mother of
Yeah.
Darkness. For
I
people who
think,
are listening, her book can be bought on Amazon, and I'll have that link in the show notes also.
yeah.
And then you also do a Substack, which is a different platform as well. Do you want to talk a little bit
Yeah.
about these different blogging platforms that you do and kind of what the difference is and what people.
Oh, I don't know. Substack's just great, but my Mother of Darkness blog, I think this one that you're okay, now you're on, yeah. And that blog is now it's frozen. Um, I think there was a report made about one of the pieces on it or something, and as a result, I can't continue it. It's just frozen in the last piece is the last, um, but I think you can leave comments or something, but basically it's not really accessible to me anymore. So it's kind of like a frozen, it's like a book, that exists out there. You can, I don't know how many pieces there are on it, but there are a lot, there are dozens, And then now Substack is just a more usable platform, and many people have moved to Substack. And oh yeah, so I just, I haphazardly, leave things there, put things up that I want to share. And I find it very flexible, and you get comments. It's more open than Facebook because I use Facebook a lot too. Oh, I also have a Facebook page, but there's a great source on Facebook that I should plug that's for the lawsuit in Montreal, which is someone really good, Kimmy Jardine is running that, and she really has a nice structured approach to information. It's called, okay, I'll tell you, and maybe we can add it as a link or something. But it's not mine, but I contribute to it. But it's called Brainwashing Victims of the Allen Memorial, and it's Facebook. Brainwashing Victims of the Allen Memorial Public News Page, I think is the title also. And so that's actually a great source of information about the lawsuit, the case, Montreal, the history of the program, and so on. And that's my Facebook page there, yeah. But so
And
I
are
also have my own Facebook page on the for survivors of the Allen Memorial, and I throw things up there that I find. I kind of have I find articles and I share them there.
Are you on any other social media platforms, or is Facebook the best place for people to connect with you?
Well, I think Facebook is good, although I hate, these days it's become so censored, and
Oh, I know.
but that is a place to find me. And I'm not on Twitter. I can't seem to get up and running on Twitter. I don't, or X, Um, I just no, I'm not that great at internet stuff, but I do, but really there's a lot of writing there. So I would say the blog, even though some of the stuff is old, is really worth visiting. I mean, there's stuff on Mengele coming. There's a piece on Mengele, how he came to Quebec. And there some of this is really from the early days. And this guy is kind of embarrassing because he ended up being the last. That's the face of my blog now, and he is a Scottish busker who I met like in 1997 when I went to Inverness in Scotland, and I met him and he sang songs to me, and I actually recorded him, and I got along with him very, for a day. And then I moved on in my trip, around Scotland. But now he's like the face of my blog in a way. But a few years ago, I suddenly thought of him and I looked him up and I saw he was an international fugitive who was arrested on rape. He was accused of rape, and he was finally arrested in the States and went back to Edinburgh, where he was tried. He's convicted, and he's in prison now for raping young girls. And I met him. He looked like the guy in the photo. He's very charming. He was fun. He played music, and found out but he had some kind of aura around him that you wouldn't, you'd be a little cautious around him. But I think he's very likely an MKULTRA himself, an MKULTRA kid, cult product of a cult or something in Scotland. And so he's ended up being the last. It's just my story of meeting him. But that would be one, outcome for MK. He shows all the signs to me of having been a mind-controlled kid, psychic abilities and all kinds of stuff, about him. And that would be one outcome, is you could end up in, an international criminal. I mean, and internationally, there was a manhunt for him, and it was in the news. It was on your news. It was everywhere.
Wow. You put a lot of work
So
into this, and there is a lot on here, so I'll definitely link this
there's
to
a
you.
lot. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff on Leonard Cohen in there too. If people want to, like, they could do a search for Leonard Cohen stories. And there's stuff I found out about Leonard being having a double in 1960, when obviously he was recruited by the CIA and he was living in Greece, and he went on a mission, and how they covered up. And now there was a double. They found a double, and somebody who resembled him enough, and they brought that person there and put him in his house, and it's like he impersonated Leonard while Leonard was off going to the Bay of Pigs, the Allen Dulles, the CIA invasion in 1961. Leonard was arrested in that. But in the months preceding, he had to go off and get trained in the States. I'm sure he went to Florida or somewhere, training in the swamps, getting weapons training and that kind of stuff in those days. But he left someone back on Hydra, this island in Greece where he has a house. He had just bought the house at that point, and it was a doppelganger. And they provided these. You can see how he was an agent. He was brought into this. Nobody knows this. I mean, I found out by accident, just by, anyway. Life magazine was there also recording it in 1960. So there's stories like that. That's, it's fascinating. But slowly you manage to provide proof for a narrative, for a story, and he's fascinating. I mean, so.
And so this one, the Mother of Darkness blog, is on Blogspot, and then Anne has a Substack as well under her name, Anne Substack. And I will have all of that linked below. In addition to her Facebook, I'll link her Amazon book. That way you guys can find her there. And then, Anne, if you want to send me that one Facebook group or page that you were telling me about, I can,
Yeah,
in addition, and then people can go check that out too.
yeah. Just another couple of links for you, yeah, because they do help, yeah, back up the case. There's a lot of information, and that's the funny thing, is there's so much proof, There is so much proof. And yet officially it never happened, you know.
Right.
Officially, there's official denial of it everywhere.
100%. Yes, even though there's documents literally from the CIA that say that they were doing this, but it's just a conspiracy theory. It's wild, you know.
It is wild.
Luckily
Isn't it
though,
wild to live in a world where you can live in that cognitive dissonance, you know, and that's most of the people you know probably will stare at you as if you were crazy, but it's changing slowly.
it is
It's
changing
getting,
slowly. Thank you. Thanks
yeah.
to you and others who have, helped pave the way
No,
for that.
thanks to you, Emma. You've done a huge service. I can't believe it. I think you're phenomenal, amazing, you know, you have so much determination and fortitude and, you know, and patience. And I mean, you're just so focused. I just like, I admire you so much.
Same. It's an honor to get to do this work and to help be a voice for people like you, and hopefully we can all bring this thing down together and hopefully I can encourage other people that didn't go through this as well to stand up and do something. That's like my biggest message is that we can all do something. It doesn't have to be a podcast. It doesn't have to be a huge commitment. It could just be buying a book or for and giving it to somebody. It could be sharing a blog post that you or somebody else made on social media. Like there's so many ways that we can circulate this information and make it more mainstream, but
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
want to be an encouragement to other people that we can all step up and do something, and we should. It's our duty to step up and do something, to be an army for survivors, to stand up for children, and it's the least that I can do. Like after what you and others actually went through, the least I can do is listen to it and help share, So it's a great honor, Anne, and it's always a pleasure having you on. Was there anything else that you wanted to share today or talk about that we didn't
we
get
could have
to?
gone, we could have gone in another direction, but I think we'll do it at another time. And no, I just want to thank you, you know, just thanks for listening. Yeah, and letting me talk because I appreciate it. I have a lot to say, you know, and it's nice to have a forum. It's nice to have a platform sometimes. Obviously, I have a
It
lot of platforms, but you know, I really appreciate there being a human on the other side. Yeah,
is. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yes, and I appreciate you coming on. I'll link your other interview too in the show notes. That way people can go check out our first one. And you guys, I
yeah.
really encourage you guys to go buy Anne's book. The holidays are coming up. It makes a great gift to give somebody, especially if you have friends that you can talk to about this stuff who are more open-minded. It's a great gift. It's also a great gift that you can give yourself to keep in your own library. I think supporting survivor businesses is the best thing that we can do. There's all these nonprofits that want your money and they say they're going to help survivors. We don't always know where that money goes. So my best advice to you on the other side of the screen is just go right to the source. If a survivor has a business, go support it, and Anne's been generous enough to compile her testimony into a book, into blogs, and so subscribe to her Substack, go check out Mother of Darkness blog, read her book, give it as a gift if you guys have people in your life that would want that. And just thank you on the other side of the screen also for tuning in. We couldn't do this without you guys. It's an incredible journey getting to see more and more people jumping on and supporting and sharing and believing this information and actually taking it to heart and helping advocate. So we couldn't do this without you guys either on the other side of the screen. So thank you guys for listening. God bless you, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.